So good morning, everyone, and welcome back to this last day of the retreat. As you see, the theme for my presentation today is called Glimpsing the Reign of God, Rules for Engaging Culture in Mission. And let me begin with a little introduction. This talk, I've only given this talk once before, and it was actually quite a few years ago. And it was during a kind of a training session for people interested in going on mission. And the people who organized my presentations said, well, we'd like to have you do something on the theology of mission, and then we'd like you to do something that's practical. And so I really almost panicked when I heard that, because I'm much more of a theologian. I'm not someone who can give you the nuts and bolts. And in fact, even as a theologian, I think that should be something that the context should dictate, and not somebody coming in and tell you how to do mission or run your parish or anything else. The best practical stuff you can get, I think, is a good theology. So I was really kind of, what do I say in this? And then I began to realize I do have quite a bit of experience living in other cultures and in intercultural communities. And what I began to do was I began to write down kind of little practical things that have helped me in the past. And I began calling them rules for engaging in mission. And I think we could say even these could be rules in engaging in intercultural communities as well. I have to admit from the start that these are rules which I have not always kept. And I have not myself been perfect in any of these. But I think if I had, I would have been a much better missionary and a much better community member. I think you too, if you try to live up to these rules, they can help you. And I think they are at least good ideals to try to practice and try to live up to. What I hope this presentation is going to be is really a more whimsical presentation. I think a lot of this stuff, and you actually participate in a lot of this stuff and practice a lot of this stuff. And I always go back, I think I said this a couple of years ago when I gave your retreat before, I go back to a line that Pat Connor, who was an Australian SVD who died a few years ago, but he was giving us a retreat back in the 1980s. And he said, when I begin this retreat, I want to say, we don't always need to be taught, but we do need to be reminded. And so this is what I want to do in this presentation, is just in a whimsical kind of way, remind ourselves of what it means to be a missionary and engaging in cultures. In any case, I'm convinced that if we try our best to engage in culture and the cultures of others as we do mission and as we are in community, we can get a glimpse of the reign of God, to which we are called as Christians and as missionaries to embody and demonstrate and to proclaim in our mission. I have to say at the outset, I mentioned this to John earlier, a lot of what I'm going to say I learned from John Kirby, and especially the time, a couple of weeks, but the time, very significant time that I spent with him in his institute at Tix in Tamale in northern Ghana. So I'm grateful for John for a lot of what I'm going to say here. These rules, except maybe for the first one, are in no particular order in terms of a hierarchy or in terms of their importance. And there may be more of them that maybe as we have our discussion later on, some of you might say, well, this is something that I felt helpful or I found helpful in my own missionary or community experience. So this is by no means exhaustive either. So rule number one is learn and keep on learning the language. As I say, these rules are in no particular order, but I think this is really still number one. As I say, this is the only exception to that. Language is really the key to everything. It gives us an inside look at the culture. It's like the gift box in which the culture is contained. And language reveals so much about a culture, how people relate to one another. So in German, you know, whether you say the more formal Sie or the more informal Du, and of course the same is in Spanish with tu and usted, or in Italian with tu and lei, or in Korean, I understand that you have to find out if the person's older than you or younger than you, and then there's a certain way of talking in that regard. Vietnamese, I think, is somewhat similar in that regard. Language reveals the structures in society and in family. So in Ilocano, the language that I spoke when I was in the Philippines in the northern part of Luzon, you know, your older brother is always manong. Your younger brother or your younger sister is always ading. And it's just the way you address people. Some of you may know Mesan Tetek Po, who was one of our seminarians who was ordained a couple of years ago. He's from Togo. And his name Mesan is not really a name. It's that he's the third son in the family. And every son and every daughter has its own name. I think in Chinese, at least I hear that you number one son, number two son. I don't know if that's true, but you know, language reveals you know, society structures and family structures. You learn how people understand agency. Like for instance, in Filipino languages, almost the passive is accepted. I don't know if the Filipinos here would agree with this, but I know, like in Ilocano, when I speak, I don't say I see you. You say you are seen by me. That's the ordinary way of talking. It's somehow more passive, and that shows something about the culture. Titles. In some languages, titles are very important. In other languages, in many ways, like in English, particularly American English, titles are not. And sometimes titles seem artificial. You know, so many of us who are Americans, we don't like to be called by various titles. And proverbs are so important in a language, and to get to know proverbs and idioms. I remember John Kirby telling us in Ghana, one time he went into a bar in Ghana and the people were talking and he said in tree something about, you know, he gave a proverb and one of the men in the bar came back with another proverb and John hit him with another proverb and they were just amazed, you know, how much John knew of the language. And but it also, you know, sometimes languages are spoken in so many indirect kind of ways through proverbs. And the other thing is, and again, I've learned this from John Kirby, language learning or learning language is already mission. Even struggling with the language tells people how important they are. People are always honored when you're trying to learn the language because it says to them that you're taking their lives and their culture seriously. So as John insists in a wonderful article that he wrote, a long time ago, you know, language learning is not just preparation for mission, it's already mission. It's a passport into people's lives. If you know the language, people tell you things about the culture that you wouldn't know otherwise, and you become friends with people within the culture. This is my experience in Italy. When I was in Italy, you know, I struggled with the language always, of course, because I think as Roger mentioned the other day, you know, there aren't that many Italian speakers in the Collegio where we studied. But I was like a chaplain to a youth group there. And, you know, in my struggles and everything else with the language, I began to perfect it much more. And I am still in touch with some of these people today who are now grandparents, of course. Also in the Philippines, you know, my language skills were not all that great in Ilocano because I had to teach in English and so forth, but it was really a passport into the local culture of people. And I learned so much, even from, you know, especially in the beginning, my bungling. And we need constantly to study the language, to work on our accent and all that. This is something I think that needs to go on and on and on. You know, we can master the language to a certain extent, but there's so much that's always rich in the language that we need constantly to work on. Rule 2 is to bond with the people. I remember again when I was in Ghana and under John's tutelage, he gave us an article to read by a couple that taught at Fuller Seminary at that time in Pasadena, with Tom and Betty Sue Brewster. And the article was about the importance of bonding with the people that you serve and to do it right away. You know, don't, even when you come into a situation, live in isolation in your rectory or your language school, even at the beginning. You know, get out there and try to bond with the people. I think this is one of the great dangers today of social media. You know, Facebook and FaceTime and all these things. I've heard people say, like our CTP people, they go to another country, let's say in, you know, Chile or Argentina or whatever, and they spend so much time in their rooms talking with their family on Facebook or on you know, Twitter or something like that. You know, this is a real danger that we don't really get out there and bond with the people. I remember one time at a CTP, our cross-cultural training program service, when we were sending our seminarians out, I gave a homily, and my homily had 2 points. The first point was, you need to leave, and then you need to arrive. And I think this is really so important as we engage in cross-cultural and intercultural mission. Because mission is essentially relationship. It's not what we do for people, but it's who we are when we are with people. This is, I think, the secret to understanding mission today. And it's only with friends in the culture are we ultimately going to come to know the culture and really begin to enjoy the culture and really begin to enjoy, that glimpse of the reign of God, where all people are one and bonded together. Rule number 3 is listen at least a year before speaking. Now, this is a bit of an exaggeration, but I think it's an important point. I think this is one of the hardest and yet one of the most necessary disciplines in an intercultural community and in intercultural mission is to listen and not speak too soon. I think it's difficult because we hear out of our own culture. Our culture is like a filter, through which we hear. And what we have to learn to do is to hear what is really being said. That's what's really important, I think. And one way to do this is shut up. Don't speak, maybe an exaggeration, but for about a year. In other words, don't react to anything for about a year. Don't try to offer your opinions right away or come to a quick judgment. We have to practice what theologians call, missiologists call, a hermeneutics of appreciation. There's the hermeneutics of suspicion, where we kind of say, oh, everything, I don't know about this, why is this happening and all that. But the other is, let's say, let's try to enjoy it. Let's try to be positive about it and not make any negative judgments. So don't be critical. Don't presume that you know what people are talking about. Rule 4 is to be careful about asking questions. And this I've learned from Roger Schrader and Claude Marie Barbour. The South African theologian Albert Nolan, one time I heard him give a talk about enculturation, and he said this. He said, when you do enculturation, he says you have to listen, ask questions, and listen. But, and this is me talking now, but we need to be careful about what we ask and how we ask. Ask something like this: could you help me understand what is going on in this situation? Not, why do these people do such and such and such? Roger and Claude Marie have taken hundreds, thousands of students to a Native American reservation in South Dakota. And they tell them, don't ask any questions when you go. Let the people teach you. And I think this is the point here. Let the people teach you. The main thing, again, is to listen and not to bombard your hosts with questions or your other, community members, new community members in your intercultural community with questions. Because remember, our questions come from our own perspectives. So it's important that we have an openness that we can listen to what people are really saying. So suspending questions, I think, helps in suspending how we hear and see things. And this is a real asceticism. This is a really good discipline to practice. Rule 5 is to practice seeing. And what I suggest is we do this by reading poetry. When I was in Ghana, I don't know, John, if you remember this or if you even remember this proverb, but I've always remembered it. You said there's a Ghanaian proverb that says, the stranger has eyes like saucers, but sees nothing. We see plenty, of course, but do we really see? Do we really see the other? There's a great example of this that the great historian of religion, Mircea Eliade, tells about aid workers in Africa. They were showing people a film on how to dig flushless latrines in an African village to improve hygiene and so forth. And so they showed them a film on how to do this, and all the people were there, and they were looking at the film, and the film was very short and very simple. And they finished the film, and the aid worker said, "Well, what did you see?" And there was silence. All the people gathered there. There was total silence. Finally, one of the elders said, "I saw a chicken cross the screen." And the aid worker said, "What? You know, you watched this movie about digging latrines and you saw a chicken." And they played the film over again. And sure enough, at one point in the film, a chicken kind of flew across the screen. You know, they didn't understand toilets and latrines. What they understood were chickens. And so that's what they saw. We only see what we expect to see. And so we have to really work hard at seeing what's really there. I remember too, a number of years ago, about 10 years ago now, I went back to a visit in the Philippines, and I was staying at this like seminary, and there was a garden there in the compound of the seminary. And I thought it was really kind of ugly. I mean, it was dry, and it was, you know, sandy, and it was not very beautiful according to my standards. But this was in the middle of a town, and there was lots of noise outside and so forth. And this place was actually a haven for people. They saw it as a haven, even though it was not, you know, what I would consider a beautiful garden to be. So it might sound strange, but I think to help us see, it might be a good practice to read poetry. Poets see things much more clearly than we do, and we ordinary people do. They help us see, I think, because they have such a keen sense of seeing and hearing and so forth. When I gave a retreat a number of years ago in Ireland, and at the end of the retreat, the SVDs there gave me a copy of the Irish poet Seamus Heaney's book called Seeing Things. And they said that because I was talking a lot about learning how to see and stuff like that. And I remember the poetry was very, very difficult to read. But I remember one wonderful poem about a skylight that Haney wrote about. He said, you know, he lived in this farmhouse, and his wife insisted in putting a skylight in the roof, and he didn't like it. He was really upset about it until they did it. And then he said, all of a sudden, this light came into the room, and it was so beautiful. And he said, all of a sudden, I got a real new appreciation of the story in the Gospels about how the men opened up the roof and they let the paralytic down. It's a beautiful poem, but I always kind of remember that as something really, really powerful. The Nigerian theologian Aboni Hangmegi Orobator has a beautiful poem on the names of God. I don't have it on the screen, but let me just read it to you. It's longer than this, but just a few lines. Ancient deity, unbreakable stone, consoler and comforter, providing salvation, grandfather, who alone is the great one, watcher of everything, who is not surprised by anything, piler of rocks into towering mountains, sun too bright for our gaze, eye of the sun, artist in chief, drummer of life, owner of the head. It's just wonderful images, I think, which just help us, so much. I think it would be a great practice, and I found this myself. Who are the local poets where you are? Try to read them. I think it's really, really very helpful. Rule 6, pray about your experiences. I think it's a good practice to review the day in God's presence. You know, did we go shopping? Did we see something particular in the market that struck us about the culture or whatever? Did we visit a sick person? Were we offended by a confrere or by a parishioner? Was there a flash of intimacy somehow in our community? We can thank God for that. Are we still confused in language or culture or relationships or whatever? Pray about those kinds of things. Prayer is also just a kind of listening. And as we go over the things of the day, to just listen to see what God might say about that. Spirit, we say, is always active in our culture, but the Spirit is also active in our lives. And if we listen to what's going on in our lives, I think this will be helpful very much. Crossing a culture is a journey. And I think we need to work at where we are on that journey as we pray every day. Rule number 7 is get a spiritual director. Because you are on a spiritual journey, you need a spiritual guide. And as soon as possible, find someone with whom you can talk and be frank and honest with. Make a contract for a year. You know, you don't have to enter into this, you know, for the whole time that you're there. You know, try out a spiritual director for a year, but try it out for a whole year. And keep no secrets from your spiritual director. Tell him or her everything that's going on in your life. Your fascination with the culture, your difficulties with the culture, your prayer, your frustrations with confreres or with parishioners or whatever it might be. I think just saying it out loud really helps. And it's more than therapy. I think it's real spiritual practice that will really help us bond with people and with cultures and will make us happy in ourselves. Rule number 8, read the literature, listen to music, watch TV. I think one of the best ways to get to know a culture is through its artists. I mentioned before poets, Robert Frost, Emily Dickinson, read them. You can really get an insight into at least the dominant culture, American ethos. And there are other poets from other groups and so forth that really give us an insight into this. I remember when I first went to the Philippines, I was introduced to the work of Jose Rizal, who is the national hero of the Philippines and a great literary figure in the Philippines. And he wrote 2 very important novels. Now I can't think of the first one, but the second one is called Noli Me Tangere. And I remember reading these novels, and they're just such an insight into the colonial situation of the Philippines during the Spanish time, and it's just so much there about the Filipino heart and the Filipino soul. It was just so helpful for me to read these novels. And Noli Me Tangere and El Filibusterismo are the two novels. I remember now. I remember on this same trip, when I saw the garden, I was really struck by the wealth now of Tagalog hymns, and how powerful they are. And again, they give you an insight into the spirituality of the people. Of course, telenovelas, in all cultures are really helpful, I think, to get an insight into what's going on in the culture. And both classical art and popular art in the particular place where you're working. And street murals, I think, are so important as well, to kind of get a sense of what people are thinking and feeling. Rule number 9 is read the anthropologists. My own experience in coming to the Philippines was I started to read some essays in anthropology, and very, very soon I began to see some of the key things in Filipino culture, the whole idea of utang na loob, which is the debt of gratitude, which is so important in Filipino culture. Hiya, shame, which is so important, or the whole idea of split level Christianity, where people can be, moral and immoral at the same time, and it's a very interesting phenomenon. Probably not just in the Philippines, but nevertheless, it was a very famous essay that talked about this. It gave me a great insight into Filipino culture, Filipino characters. I think it's really important that we always have a novel going, that we're always reading some kind of fiction. Again, that helps us to understand, the imagination of a particular place or a country. And have a book of anthropology or local history as well, that we're reading as well. I think you're going to see the ideas that you see there validated in your everyday experience. It can only help you understand this better. It sharpens your eyes again, and it sharpens your ears as well. Rule number 10, this is the second last rule: accept the fact that you'll always be a stranger. I remember someone telling me a story when I first arrived in the Philippines about an old Spanish priest in the Philippines. They asked him, after 40 years of living in the Philippines, do you understand Filipinos after 40 years of ministering to them? And he said, "El alma del Filipino es un misterio." The Filipino soul after 40 years is still a mystery to me. The longer I was in the country, the more I knew that I didn't know very much. The culture still became something that I had to learn and understand, and I knew that I never would understand it fully. Some of you Indians among you may know of a man, rather controversial, famous German missionary in the Philippines by the name of Engelbert Zeitler. One time he came to visit us in the Philippines. He was a classmate of one of the men on the faculty where I was teaching in the Philippines. And he said this: he was giving a talk to the students. He says, you go to another country, you stop in the airport, and you can write a book about it. So the first impression is you can see so much and everything else. Says you stay there a year, you might write an article. Says you stay there a couple of years and you realize that you don't know anything. You can't write anything. I think it's a kind of what the medieval mystics called a docta ignorantia, a learned ignorance. You actually do know quite a bit, but you know how much you don't know. And I think that's an important kind of humility to continue to have as we work in another culture or live in an intercultural environment. We will always be outsiders. We will always be outsiders. But the ironic thing is that knowing that also gives you a deeper and greater sense of who you are. I think I only realized who I was as an American when I lived in Italy and when I lived in the Philippines. You know, your whole culture becomes much clearer to you. So your own ignorance gives you the gift of knowing much better who you are. So we come to our last rule, and I mentioned this the other day as well, and that is practice Schreiter's rule. Some of you know Robert Schreiter, a great teacher at CTU and a great expert in the area of enculturation and so forth. The prerequisite for practicing this rule is you need to practice everything that I've said already. But then he says, once a day, you are permitted a negative or nasty thought about the culture. Now, you don't do this out loud. You don't do this in public. You do it to yourself or to a close friend. But, you know, let your frustrations get out sometimes, because trying to live in a new culture or in another culture or in a multicultural community is hard. And sometimes it makes us look stupid and it's frustrating. So we need to let off some steam. It enables us to take charge a little bit, at least for a short amount of time. And, you know, the cultures, Roger has said this over and over again in his presentations, cultures are not perfect. And we shouldn't worry too much if we get frustrated or we get angry as we really try to live in a particular culture. So just a few words of conclusion. What I've tried to present to you is a kind of a spirituality here. It's a spirituality of attending. It's a spirituality of reflection. And I think it's also a spirituality of joy. Because, you know, as we are open up in living in another culture to new ways of thinking and feeling and seeing, new friendships are going to be born. New pleasures are going to be experienced, and new ways of seeing the world that we never thought possible are going to be discovered. And in this, I think we get a glimpse of the reign of God, the reign of God that we ourselves try to embody or demonstrate and proclaim, or in more traditional language, witness to, serve and preach as we serve the church and as we serve God in mission. So that's what I would like to share with you. And I hope that it has been whimsical, and I hope that it has reminded you of some of your own experiences and maybe even commit you again to a deepening of these as well. Thanks a lot for listening.